The diplomacy of disruption, is it the diplomacy of disruption or destruction that we're seeing here?
Oh, I'd say, I'm ever the optimist. It is hopefully, and I believe it is the prior. That President Trump has certainly disrupted diplomacy as the status quo does not stand anymore. But I think what we're seeing is already some progress in that his disruption of diplomacy is really, in my mind, really the diplomacy of disruption. So, it's not just about doing things differently. It's about will there be progress, but because he's changed the approach that has so long been one of China's slowly gradual rise, and in some ways I'd say the relative decline of industries and other businesses. I think those days are over. But my hope is that this disruption of diplomacy ultimately will lead to a better, more balanced trade situation that will be to the benefit of both the United States and China.
Curtis, I want to throw up a chart for if those that are still playing along at home as to where we are when it comes to this tit-for-tat tariff situation. We've had $50 billion. We were talking about an additional $200 billion. And now we're talking about an additional $267 billion on top of that, which essentially is basically the kitchen sink, right? How does that progress the conversation with Beijing? And does this come down to essentially an ideological fight?
Well, as I think, as we've long known President Trump, even prior to his time in this White House, this is a man who's about the art of the deal. It's really about a discussion. And I think the Chinese leadership in the past has even said the size of the trade deficit between the U.S. and China is not sustainable. Trump in many ways is taking them at their word and trying to build on it. But very clearly, if it's $200 billion, or as we note, the whole kitchen sink of all trade between the U.S., I'm no fan of trade wars. I'm no fan of tariff wars. But I am certainly a fan of disrupting a status quo where we have seen, quite frankly, China take advantage of the system, and we have seen Chinese violation of intellectual property rights. I have an op-ed with a former Beijing AP correspondent coming out today in the Los Angeles Times, and we're going to argue very clearly that there can be some good out of a trade war if it does indeed lead to a resetting and a discussing of what has long been an unequal relationship between the United States and China.
And of course, we're seeing the U.S. economy being pretty strong. The GTV Go library showing you that GDP, payrolls, also industrial production, they're still looking pretty solid. If we can take my chart, guys, you can see this gain in all economic data. How much leverage does this give President Trump in this trade war?
Clearly, with the U.S. economy firing on all cylinders, it works to the United States to President Trump's advantage, certainly in the short term. Now, the question again is, can any economy continue to grow and grow and grow? There's inevitably a cycle of business. Who will outlast the other? There's been some talk, though, that, maybe China, given its government system, is better able to outlast a robust democracy like the United States, which does have midterm elections coming up. But I would argue in the long term, there is a force working against China, and that is its very own demographics. Then we think about an aging China. Clearly, the Chinese government needs to right now think through how to stabilize this relationship between the U.S. and China and how to move this discussion forward. And to your earlier question about more tariffs, whether it's $200 million, $200 billion, or $265 billion, all this, I hope, will lead to continued discussions and an ultimate deal that leads to a more balanced trade relationship between the United States and China.
Will this be exactly the Achilles heel for Chinese and government officials because of how centralized power is towards President Xi Jinping, especially this year when he's become essentially president for life? If anything goes wrong with the Chinese economy, a lot of the blame will fall on him.
Indeed. It's interesting. I saw some data this morning, and to be honest, I'm never sure about the quality of data coming out of China. But there was some data that the Chinese middle class maybe had, I don't say soured, but maybe we're beginning to think a little bit less positively about Xi Jinping since what happened earlier this year when he's effectively being able to be president for life. I think Chinese people, I used to be based in Beijing, Chinese people, American people, they all just want a better life. Our governments want a better life for our own citizens. But the question is, can it indeed be done in a way where all sides benefit? That continues to be the challenge. And our focus, understandably, is on the U.S.-China trade relationship. But the reality is also that so many countries here in Asia are also going to be impacted as this moves forward. Will China begin to dump goods across the region that it cannot sell in the U.S.? will U.S. and other companies begin to rethink where they put their supply chain? In many ways, these are uncertain waters. But again, my hope is that that uncertainty, that disruption, is a little bit strategic and will again lead to a better relationship between China and the United States.
Curtis, perhaps dampening your optimism, but certainly the complications when it comes to the diplomatic relationships in this part of the world are getting more interesting as well, right? As you say, this kind of diplomacy of disruption. Do you think that takes into account the kind of risk that it makes to the US pivot or the US position in Asia, given at a time Washington is looking for help from China, from Moscow, from Japan when it comes to their North Korea issue as well, and at the same time you have Beijing and Moscow getting a little bit closer as well. Do you think this trade war kind of signifies a lack of appreciation for the security and the diplomatic implications in the meantime?
I think some of those questions are probably best posed to the Trump administration itself. Very clearly, so many of these issues are connected, if not fully integrated. But again, President Trump has made very clear he's been elected really to be the president of the United States of Americans. And he's doing, I think, just like President Obama, what he thinks is right for the American people. I was struck by a recent piece on Bloomberg that talked about the Vietnam government's reaction to what was going on between the U.S. and China. And it had me smile because the Vietnam's leadership said one result will be it's going to force Vietnam to liberalize its economy. So again, very clearly, this disruption of diplomacy is leading to what I believe will be better results in the long run. Likewise, some of the initial reports out of a G20 meeting just this past Friday talked about that leadership saying, well, maybe WTO, this World Trade Organization, has also to reform and revisit some of its rules.
What about what's happening here in the U.S.? Because once these tariffs come into place, they will affect everything from internet costs to plastics and chemicals, and this will raise the cost for consumers. How much patience will consumers here in the U.S. have for President Trump's policies?
Right now, a great question. Right now, a little bit unclear. To what degree will these higher costs be passed down to consumers? To what degree will some businesses try to absorb them? Will some businesses begin to think differently about how they're going to transition to a very different kind of world? We just completed here in Singapore our 5th Milken Institute Asia Summit, where there were leaders from across the region really trying to think through how do we manage this transition. Clearly everyone wants their businesses to grow, but how can it be done in a more sustainable manner? And I think businesses also need to think through their supply chains and how are they going to adjust to this really uncertain world as disruption continues in that economic relationship between the United States and China.